February 1991. The scorching Iraqi desert. A squad of U.S. psychological operations soldiers drives towards enemy lines in Humvee equipped with massive speakers. Their weapon? A recording that would soon break the will of an entire Iraqi division. The sound of helicopter rotors fills the air, but there are no helicopters. Just speakers broadcasting the distinctive whop-whop-whop of incoming attack choppers, along with the rumbling of tanks. As fear grips the Iraqi soldiers, leaflets rain from above. Surrender now and live. Within hours, over 1,000 Iraqi troops emerged from their bunkers, hands raised. Not a single shot was fired. This wasn't luck. This was psychological warfare, a battlefield where the mind is the target and victory comes without bloodshed. But to understand how mere sounds and paper could defeat an army, we need to step back and explore the invisible battlefield where these mind games began. Ancient Chinese General Sun Tzu wrote, "Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." This principle would shape warfare for millennia to come. But it wasn't until World War I that psychological warfare became a science. The Germans were the first to establish a dedicated psychological warfare unit. Their mission: destroy enemy morale before the first bullet flew. They distributed newspapers filled with stories of German victories, dropped leaflets warning of inevitable defeat, and even broadcasted recordings of soldiers' screams across no man's land. But it was World War II that transformed psychological warfare forever. The Allies created the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to both the CIA and modern psychological operations units. Their methods were revolutionary. They studied enemy culture, exploited fears, and crafted messages that warned their way into enemy minds. The OS understood something fundamental about human nature. Fear of the unknown is often more powerful than fear of the visible enemy. They exploited this by creating uncertainty and doubt in the enemy ranks. Radio broadcasts would spread rumors of spies within German units. Leaflets would reveal intimate details about German commanders' personal lives, suggesting their communications were compromised. In the Pacific Theater, psychological warfare took on an entirely different dimension. American forces faced an enemy driven by a complex code of honor and cultural beliefs. The Japanese soldiers' greatest fear wasn't death, it was shame. Understanding this, Allied psychological operations crafted messages that offered honorable alternatives to suicide charges. This cultural understanding became the cornerstone of modern psychological warfare. It wasn't enough to simply frighten the enemy. You had to understand their deepest motivations, their cultural touchstones, their fundamental beliefs. The most effective psychological operations weren't based on threats, but on offering alternatives that aligned with the enemy's own value system. The Korean War brought new innovations. UN forces discovered that cold was a more effective weapon than heat in breaking enemy resolve. They dropped leaflets explaining how to surrender safely, complete with detailed maps to UN positions. These leaflets were designed to look like Chinese military documents, increasing their credibility. When captured Chinese soldiers were interviewed, many still had these leaflets hidden in their uniforms. Vietnam became the testing ground for the most sophisticated psychological operations yet. The Americans developed the Chu Hoi, open arms program, offering enemy soldiers a way to defect with honor. They studied Viet Cong communication patterns and mimicked their writing style and counterfeit orders. They even exploited local superstitions, playing recordings of ghost voices in areas believed to be haunted. But perhaps the most significant development was the understanding that psychological warfare wasn't just about destroying enemy morale. It was about offering a better alternative. The most successful operations gave enemy soldiers a reason to live rather than just a reason to fear death. This humanitarian approach would prove more effective than any threat. The digital age brought new battlefields for psychological warfare. Social media, instant communications, and the internet created unprecedented opportunities to influence enemy thinking. Modern psychological operations units can target individual soldiers through their phones, create convincing deepfakes, and spread information faster than any leaflet drop. Yet the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Whether through ancient drums or modern smartphones, psychological warfare succeeds by understanding the enemy's mind and offering them a path that serves your objectives while respecting their values. As we'll see, the masters of this art form would take these principles to extraordinary new heights. The evolution of psychological warfare reveals patterns that transcend time and technology. In ancient Rome, armies would scatter caltrops, four-pointed metal spikes, across battlefields. Their real power wasn't in how many soldiers they wounded. It was how they forced entire armies to move slowly, constantly watching their feet. The psychological impact far outweighed the physical threat. During the Crusades, Saladin's forces used psychological warfare masterfully. They would allow Christian captives to return to their armies, but only after witnessing the Muslim forces' vast supplies and weaponry. These soldiers would spread tales of the enemy's overwhelming strength, damaging morale before battles began. The American Revolution saw Benjamin Franklin become one of history's first psychological warfare pioneers. He created and distributed fake newspapers throughout the colonies, filled with manufactured atrocity stories about Native Americans working with the British. These stories helped unite the colonies against British rule and showcased how psychological warfare could shape public opinion. Napoleon Bonaparte elevated psychological warfare to an art form. He understood that perception was often more important than reality. His armies would march in circles around cities they besieged, using the same units multiple times to create the illusion of endless reinforcements. Enemy commanders, believing they faced overwhelming forces, would often surrender without a fight. The American Civil War brought new dimensions to psychological warfare. Confederate raiders would wear Union uniforms and spread disinformation among civilian populations. Union forces retaliated by distributing counterfeit Confederate currency, destabilizing the South's economy and eroding civilian confidence in their government. But it was the advent of mass communication that truly revolutionized psychological warfare. The ability to reach thousands, even millions, of enemy soldiers and civilians simultaneously changed the nature of conflict. Radio broadcasts during World War could reach entire armies. Leaflet drops could blanket whole cities. The scale of psychological operations expanded exponentially. This evolution taught military strategists a crucial lesson. The most effective psychological warfare operations weren't single actions, but carefully orchestrated campaigns that built upon each other. Like a chess master thinking several moves ahead, psychological warfare planners had to consider how each operation would affect future operations. The power of psychological warfare lies not just in its ability to demoralize enemies, but in its capacity to achieve military objectives without destruction. A surrendering enemy soldier doesn't just remove one rifle from the battlefield. They provide intelligence, reduce the cost of reconstruction, and most importantly, prove to their comrades that surrender is a viable option. As we'll see in the next chapter, the true masters of psychological warfare would take these fundamental principles and elevate them to unprecedented levels of sophistication. Success in psychological warfare isn't measured in enemy casualties, it's measured in enemy surrenders. No one understood this better than the British Special Operations Executive during World War II. Their Operation Periwig created an entire fake German resistance movement, complete with manufactured underground newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even staged acts of sabotage. The brilliance lay in its subtlety. Instead of obvious propaganda, they planted seeds of doubt. They created fictional resistance cells and attributed real acts of sabotage to them. German security forces wasted countless hours hunting phantoms, while real resistance fighters operated more freely. The Soviets mastered a different approach. During the Battle of Stalingrad, they positioned loudspeakers across the front lines. In the freezing winter nights, they played recordings of soup being slurped, fires crackling, and soldiers enjoying hot meals. The sounds tortured the freezing, starving German soldiers. But the psychological masterpiece came next. They played recordings of rats squeaking, thousands of them, creating the impression that even rats were abandoning the German positions. The British turned weather itself into a psychological weapon. Operation Cornflakes involved dropping waterproof mailbags filled with fake German mail into bombed railway lines. As German postal workers recovered and delivered these bags, They unknowingly distributed anti-Nazi propaganda disguised as ordinary letters. Some contained fake ration cards, creating the impression that the German rationing system was compromised. The Americans developed what they called nostalgia warfare. In Vietnam, they studied the cultural importance of family bonds in Vietnamese society. During Tet, the Vietnamese New Year when families traditionally reunite, they broadcast recordings of families celebrating, children laughing, and traditional songs. The psychological impact on Viet Cong soldiers, isolated in the jungle during this important cultural holiday, was devastating. But perhaps the most sophisticated psychological operations came during the Cold War. The CIA's Operation Mongoose didn't just spread disinformation. It created entire fictional lives. They planted fake documents, staged photographs, and created elaborate backstories for non-existent Cuban dissidents. The operation was so convincing that even after it was exposed, some Cubans continued believing these fictional characters were real. The Israelis elevated psychological warfare to an art form during the Yom Kippur War. They allowed Egyptian forces to intercept fake radio transmissions, suggesting Israel had suffered catastrophic losses. When the Egyptians advanced, expecting to find broken units, they instead ran into prepared Israeli positions. The psychological impact of this reversal shattered Egyptian morale more effectively than any bombing campaign. Modern masters of psychological warfare understand that credibility is their most powerful weapon. During Desert Storm, coalition forces studied Iraqi military culture extensively. They discovered that Iraqi officers would often exaggerate enemy capabilities to avoid blame for failures. Coalition psychological operations exploited this by providing accurate, but intimidating, descriptions of their weapons. Iraqi officers, attempting to protect themselves, would further exaggerate these reports up the chain of command. The digital age brought new opportunities for psychological manipulation. During the Kosovo conflict, NATO forces hacked Serbian military computers and planted false information about unit positions. But the true genius wasn't in the fake information. It was in the real information they left untouched. Serbian commanders, unable to distinguish truth from fiction, began doubting even accurate intelligence. The Gulf War introduced another revolutionary concept in psychological warfare: the weaponization of mercy. Coalition forces dropped millions of leaflets explaining exactly how Iraqi units could surrender safely. They included detailed instructions, maps, and even phrases in English that surrendering soldiers could use. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategic. Every Iraqi soldier carrying a surrender leaflet became an unwitting psychological warfare agent, showing their comrades that surrender was possible and planned for. The PSOOP masters understood that sometimes the most effective message wasn't a message at all, but rather the demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. During Operation Desert Storm, they allowed Iraqi forces to witness the precision of coalition airstrikes. They didn't need to tell Iraqi soldiers they were outmatched. The soldiers could see it themselves. This created what psychologists call anticipatory surrender. Soldiers would give up not because of what had happened, but because of what they feared would happen. British forces in Northern Ireland developed what became known as whisper campaigns. They would plant rumours about IRA leaders living luxuriously while their soldiers suffered. These rumours were specially crafted to exploit existing tensions within the organisation. The genius was in their delivery. Rather than broadcasting them widely, they leaked them slowly through trusted community sources, making them nearly impossible to trace or counter. The Russians mastered what they called reflexive control, the art of manipulating an enemy into making decisions that appear to be their own, but actually serve your objectives. During the Cold War, they would allow Western intelligence to discover fake documents suggesting Soviet weaknesses. Western forces would then adjust their strategies to exploit these non-existent vulnerabilities, actually weakening their own positions. This approach reached new heights during the Chechen conflicts. Russian psychological warfare units would create elaborate false flag operations, making it appear that Chechen units were fighting each other. They exploited tribal rivalries and historical grievances, turning potential allies against each other without ever firing a shot. These masters of psychological warfare understood that the most effective operations often appear to have no author at all. As we'll see in our next section, the weapons they developed to deliver these messages were just as sophisticated as the messages themselves. The tools of psychological warfare range from the elegantly simple to the technologically complex. During World War II, British intelligence crafted one of their most effective weapons from nothing more than paper and ink: the grey propaganda leaflet. Unlike obvious propaganda, these leaflets appear to be German military documents that had accidentally fallen into civilian hands. The believability made them devastatingly effective. Operation Wandering Soul in Vietnam showcased how cultural understanding could transform simple technology into a powerful psychological weapon. American forces recorded ghost sounds and Buddhist chants, playing them in areas where the Viet Cong operated at night. In Vietnamese culture, it was believed that spirits of the dead must be buried in their homelands to find peace. These recordings, suggesting the souls of fallen soldiers were cursed to wander forever, struck deep into enemy beliefs. Modern military units developed vehicles specifically designed for psychological operations. The EC-100 and 30J Commando Solo aircraft can hijack radio and television frequencies in enemy territory, broadcasting its own content. But its real power isn't in the technology, it's in the message crafting. Teams of psychologists and cultural experts design content that appears to be local programming, slowly introducing subtle changes in narrative. The Soviets pioneered what they called black radio stations. These broadcasted what appeared to be anti-Soviet programming, building credibility with their audience. But they would occasionally slip in carefully crafted disinformation, using their listeners' trust against them. Some of these stations operated for years before their true nature was discovered. Social media became a new frontier for psychological operations. Israel's Unit 8200 developed systems that could create thousands of realistic-looking social media accounts, each with its own posting history and network of connections. These accounts wouldn't spread obvious propaganda. Instead, they would subtly influence online discussions, making certain viewpoints appear more popular than they really were. The US military created mobile audio-visual units, MAVU, teams equipped with projectors, sound systems, and cultural expertise. They would set up movie screenings in villages, mixing entertainment with subtle messaging. The key wasn't the technology, it was understanding how to package messages in culturally acceptable forms. Cell phones transformed the battlefield of the mind. During operations in Afghanistan, coalition forces could send targeted text messages to specific geographic areas. They would warn civilians about upcoming operations or provide information about Taliban activities in their area. The personal nature of these messages made them particularly effective. Radio Free Europe became one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare tools ever created. What made it unique wasn't its technology, it was its commitment to truth. By broadcasting accurate news and cultural programs, it built unshakable credibility. When it needed to influence opinion, subtle shifts in tone and story selection proved more powerful than any propaganda broadcast. The British perfected the art of rumor warfare during World War II. They created the SIBS program, carefully crafted rumors designed to spread through enemy territory. Each rumor was scientifically designed to be memorable and believable, yet impossible to disprove. They would plant these rumors through multiple sources, making them appear to emerge naturally from different locations. Print media evolved far beyond simple leaflets. Psychological warfare units created entire magazines and newspapers that looked identical to enemy publications. These would mix 90% factual content with 10% carefully crafted psychological messaging. The ratio was crucial. Too much propaganda would make the publication suspicious, too little would make it ineffective. Modern forces developed sonic weapons that could project voices into enemy positions, making it appear that the sound was coming from inside their own heads. This technology played on the natural human fear of losing touch with reality. When combined with other psychological pressures, it could make enemy units question their own sanity. Digital warfare brought new sophistication to old techniques. Computer viruses could be designed not just to damage systems. but to create uncertainty about their reliability. Israeli forces reportedly used this technique against Iranian nuclear facilities, making equipment readings unreliable and creating doubt among facility operators about their own competence. The rise of deepfake technology created unprecedented opportunities for psychological operations. Units could create convincing videos of enemy leaders appearing to give orders or make statements. The power wasn't in the fake videos themselves. It was in making enemy forces question the authenticity of real videos. But perhaps the most effective weapon in psychological warfare remained the most basic, face-to-face interaction. Human intelligence operators, trained in psychology and cultural understanding, could influence key individuals through direct contact. These personal connections often proved more powerful than any technological solution. The true art of psychological warfare weapons lies not in their sophistication, but in their application. As we'll see in our next section, understanding the human mind, both friend and foe, is what transforms these tools from mere weapons into instruments of bloodless victory. Every effective psychological operation begins with a fundamental truth. The human mind comes equipped with predictable vulnerabilities: fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Military psychologists call these entry points. Like a key fitting into a lock, the right psychological pressure can unlock predictable responses. The British psychological warfare executive discovered this during World War II. Their research showed that soldiers under stress developed what they called selective belief, accepting information that confirmed their fears while rejecting information that challenged them. They exploited this by planting stories about German secret weapons failing catastrophically. German soldiers, already anxious about new technology, readily believed these tales. Military psychologists identified key stress points in enemy units. Young soldiers far from home proved particularly vulnerable to homesickness. Experienced veterans became susceptible to doubts about leadership. Officers worried about their place in history. Each group required different psychological approaches. The Israelis mastered what they called predictive psychology during the Six-Day War. They studied how Arab military units reacted to different types of pressure. Under direct attack, these units fought fiercely. But when faced with uncertainty about their strategic situation, they often retreated to preserve their forces. Israel used this knowledge to maneuver entire enemy divisions without direct engagement. American psychological warfare units developed profiles of enemy decision-makers. They studied their education, family background, and cultural values. But the crucial insight wasn't in the profiles themselves. It was understanding how these leaders would react under specific types of stress. The human mind processes fear differently depending on cultural context. Japanese soldiers in World War II feared dishonor more than death. Vietnamese fighters were more afraid of abandoning their ancestral lands than military defeat. Understanding these cultural fear hierarchies became crucial to effective psychological operations. The Soviets pioneered the study of what they called psychological breaking points. Their research showed that every human mind has thresholds, points where certainty crumbles and doubt takes hold. These thresholds weren't universal. Cultural background, military training, and personal experience all played crucial roles in determining when a soldier would break. Training psychological warfare operators became as complex as training special forces. They needed to understand not just enemy psychology, but their own cultural biases. An American operator's concept of honor might be completely different from their target's understanding. Missing these subtle distinctions could make an entire operation backfire. Modern psychological warfare units employ cultural anthropologists and behavioral psychologists. They study everything from local fairy tales to family structures. These experts learned that effective psychological operations often worked like traditional storytelling, tapping into narratives that already existed in the target's culture. The human factor extends beyond enemy forces. Psychological warfare operators must consider civilian populations, neutral parties, and even their own troops. A message designed to demoralize enemy soldiers might accidentally strengthen civilian support for their cause. The most successful operations navigate these complex human dynamics like a chess master thinking several moves ahead. Sleep deprivation became a powerful tool for manipulating human psychology. Studies showed that after 72 hours without proper sleep, even the most hardened soldiers began experiencing cognitive distortions. Psychological warfare units would coordinate their operations to coincide with periods when enemy units were most sleep-deprived. Group psychology proved especially crucial. Humans naturally seek consensus, particularly under stress. If psychological operations could convince a few key members of a unit that resistance was futile, these beliefs would often spread throughout the group. Military psychologists called this the contagion effect. Trust networks became a central focus of modern psychological operations. Research showed that soldiers were more likely to believe information from trusted comrades than official sources. By understanding and manipulating these trust networks, psychological warfare units could make their messages appear to come from credible internal sources. The digital age brought new insights into human psychology. Social media behavior revealed patterns of information spread that psychological warfare units could exploit. They discovered that information sharing followed predictable paths through social networks, allowing them to plant messages that would naturally reach their intended targets. Perhaps most importantly, psychological warfare operators learned that human beings have an innate need for consistency. When faced with information that contradicts their beliefs, people experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The most effective psychological operations didn't try to completely change enemy beliefs. They introduced just enough doubt to make existing beliefs uncomfortable. Understanding the human factor transformed psychological warfare from an art into a science. As we'll see in our final section, this deep understanding of human psychology would lead to some of the most remarkable victories in military history. One morning in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, Iraqi soldiers emerged from their bunkers to find something unusual: thousands of leaflets showing a B-52 bomber dropping its payload. Beside it was a picture of their exact position, taken from satellites. The message was clear: tomorrow this will be you. Within 24 hours, over 40,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered. Later interviews revealed most had been carrying the leaflets when they surrendered. During the Malayan emergency, British forces achieved what many thought impossible. They turned captured communist guerrillas into effective psychological warfare agents. The Captured Enemy Personnel program didn't force these fighters to denounce their beliefs. Instead, it showed them respect, provided good treatment, and allowed them to maintain their dignity. Many voluntarily chose to help government forces, creating psychological operations that were devastatingly effective because they came from genuine belief. Israeli Defense Forces revolutionized psychological warfare during the Six-Day War with what they called predictive response operations. Rather than reacting to enemy actions, they would anticipate psychological breaking points. Before major offensives, they would plant stories about Egyptian units surrendering en masse. When the actual attacks began, Egyptian units were already psychologically primed to consider surrender as a viable option. The Vietnam War saw the development of the Chu Hoi, Open Arms, program, perhaps the most successful psychological operation in military history. Over 75,000 enemy personnel surrendered under this program. The genius wasn't in its message of amnesty. It was in its understanding of Vietnamese culture. The program offered a way to change sides while maintaining honor, a crucial cultural consideration that previous surrender programs had ignored. During the Cold War, Radio Free Europe achieved something unprecedented. It helped defeat an empire without firing a shot. By broadcasting truthful information about life outside the Iron Curtain, it created what psychologists called aspirational tension. People began questioning their system, not because of propaganda, but because they could compare it with alternatives. The Soviets' Operation Trust stands as one of the most sophisticated psychological operations ever conceived. They created an entire fake anti-Bolshevik resistance movement, complete with its own leadership structure and underground network. Western intelligence agencies poured resources into supporting this non-existent organization for years. The operation didn't just gather intelligence, it discredited legitimate resistance movements by association. Modern psychological warfare reached new heights during the Kosovo conflict. NATO forces combined old techniques with new technology in Operation Allied Force. They didn't just drop leaflets. They sent personalized text messages to Serbian soldiers' phones. They didn't just broadcast propaganda. They hijacked television signals to show Serbian leaders living in luxury while their troops suffered. The digital age brought unprecedented opportunities for psychological operations. During the Arab Spring, various actors demonstrated how social media could be used to influence mass behavior. The key insight wasn't in the technology, it was understanding how information spreads through human networks. These game-changing operations shared a common thread. They succeeded not through superior technology or resources, but through deeper understanding of human psychology. As warfare continues to evolve, this fundamental truth remains constant. The most powerful weapon in any arsenal is the ability to shape how your enemy thinks. The First Gulf War introduced another revolutionary concept, the integration of psychological operations with precision warfare. Coalition forces would warn Iraqi units of exactly when and where attacks would occur. When these predictions proved accurate, subsequent psychological messages carried unprecedented credibility. This combination of demonstration and messaging created what military psychologists called inevitable surrender syndrome. Perhaps the most significant game-changer was the recognition that effective psychological warfare isn't about breaking an enemy's spirit. It's about offering them an acceptable alternative to fighting. The most successful operations in history provided enemy forces with a way to end hostilities while maintaining their dignity. This understanding shapes modern psychological operations. Today's psychological warfare units focus less on terror and more on influence, less on breaking morale and more on building bridges. As warfare evolves into the digital age, these lessons from history continue to guide new generations of psychological warfare operators. But the ultimate game changer wasn't any single operation or technology. It was the realization that the most powerful force on any battlefield isn't bullets or bombs, but the human mind itself. If you love military history like I do, subscribe for more content like this.